Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
I'm Derek Wilson, 28 years old, walking into courtroom 305 with $24 million hanging in the balance. My estranged parents sit at the plaintiff's table, their eyes rolling when they spot me in my tailored suit. They haven't seen me in 8 years and clearly expect the same awkward kid they neglected. What they don't know is who I've become since grandfather Harold left me everything in his will. When the judge enters, his eyes widen in recognition not of my family name, but of me personally. Before I continue this story of betrayal and justice, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned to see how I turned the tables on the people who abandoned me. Growing up in a modest 2-story house in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston wasn't terrible on the surface. We had enough to eat. I had my own room with posters of basketball players tacked to blue walls, and from the outside, we probably looked like any normal family. But normal families don't feel like empty houses, even when everyone is home. My parents, Thomas and Marilyn Wilson, weren't abusive in the traditional sense. They simply acted like I was an afterthought, a responsibility they'd taken on but wished they hadn't. My father worked as a mid-level manager at an insurance company, and my mother was always busy with her real estate business and social climbing aspirations. They were far more concerned with appearances than substance. Thomas, "We need to RSVP to the Hendersons' dinner party," my mother would say, flipping through a fashion magazine without looking up. "I heard the Millers will be there, and Frank Miller just made partner at his law firm." "I've got that charity golf tournament too," my father would reply, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. "Good networking opportunity." Neither would acknowledge that I was standing right there, waiting to ask if someone could drive me to school for the science fair where my project was being featured. My grandfather, Harold, my father's father, was the only person who seemed to see me. He lived about 40 minutes away in a small but comfortable home in Quincy. From the time I was 6, I started spending weekends with him initially, because my parents were too busy to look after me, but soon because there was nowhere else I'd rather be. "Come here, Derek," Grandfather Harold would say, his eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses, patting the weathered wooden workbench in his garage. "Let me show you how to build something that lasts." Harold Wilson had built a modest but successful construction supply company from nothing. He'd sold it years before I was born and lived comfortably but not extravagantly. What I didn't know then was that he'd invested the proceeds incredibly wisely, growing his wealth in secret while living simply. "Money isn't what matters, son," he told me once, while we fished off a small pier, the summer sun warming our shoulders. "What matters is who you become while earning it." My parents resented the bond I shared with Harold. I once overheard my father arguing with him on the phone when I was 9. "You're undermining our parenting, Dad," my father had hissed. "He comes back from your place with all these questions and ideas that don't align with our plans for him. Maybe if you spent time with your son, Thomas, he wouldn't need to come to me for attention," Harold had replied, his voice carrying through the receiver. I'll never forget my 10th birthday. My parents had promised a party but canceled at the last minute because a potential client had invited them to their beach house. No apology, just a $20 bill left on the kitchen counter with a hastily scribbled note. I sat alone until the doorbell rang. It was Grandfather Harold with a small chocolate cake in a wrapped package. "Happy birthday, counselor," he'd said with a wink, using the nickname he'd given me after I'd successfully argued why I should be allowed to stay up 30 minutes later on weekends. The present was a book about famous court cases throughout American history. Harold had noticed how I'd become fascinated with justice and fairness, concepts I suppose were natural for a child who experienced so little of either at home. "You've got the mind for it, Derek," he told me as I flipped through the pages with wide eyes. "A good lawyer needs to understand people, have empathy, but also clarity. You've got both in spades." That was the day my path began to take shape, though it would be years before I fully committed to it. And it was also the day I began to understand that the distance between my parents and me wasn't something I had caused. It was a choice they had made, one that Grandfather Harold was trying his best to counterbalance. By 16, the emotional gulf between my parents and me had evolved from neglect into something more actively negative. As I developed my own personality and interests, it became clear that I was not becoming the trophy child they had envisioned to complement their social climbing ambitions. Our three-bedroom house had been traded up for a larger colonial in Newton, a more affluent suburb, stretching their finances but providing the address they coveted. My room was larger, but felt even less like home. Their conversations around me had shifted from simply excluding me to comparing me unfavorably to the children of their social circle. The Bradford son got accepted to a rowing camp in Switzerland. My mother commented over a dinner where I was physically present but socially invisible. And the Thompson's daughter is taking advanced violin with that instructor from Juilliard. My father would grunt in agreement, then add, "Networking starts early these days. These experiences are what get kids into the right schools, meet the right people, the right schools, the right people." These phrases punctuated my adolescence like verbal jabs, constant reminders that my ordinariness was a disappointment. My junior year, I came home with news that I'd scored in the 98th percentile on my PSATs and had been made editor of the school newspaper. I'd waited until they were both home, rehearsing how I'd share this achievement. "That's nice, Derek," my mother said, barely glancing up from her phone. "Did you see that Janet Lewis's daughter was featured in Boston Magazine's 20 Under 20 list? Now that's the kind of accomplishment that stands out," my father added. "The Harris's boy got a perfect score and is already interning at his father's investment firm. That's building a future." I stopped sharing accomplishments with them after that. When the time came for SAT prep, my parents declared it wasn't in the budget despite the brand new luxury SUV in the driveway and my mother's fresh collection of designer handbags. It was grandfather Harold who quietly paid for my prep classes and later my college application fees. "They can't see past their own reflections," Harold told me during one of our weekend visits. I'd just turned 17 and was helping him build a new deck on his house. "Some people get so caught up in appearing successful that they miss actual success standing right in front of them." He wiped sweat from his brow and looked at me squarely. "Promise me you'll measure your life by what you contribute, not what you accumulate, Derek." I nodded, absorbing his words while hammering a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. Harold had continued to nurture my interest in law, sending me articles about interesting cases and books about justice. Without telling my parents, I'd decided to pursue pre-law studies, inspired by both Harold's encouragement and perhaps a subconscious desire to understand the rules of a world that had allowed my own parents to abandon their responsibilities so completely. When college acceptance letters arrived, my parents' response to my scholarship offers was tepid at best. "State schools are fine if that's all you can manage," my mother sniffed, as though my achievements were a personal shortcoming rather than something to celebrate. My father was more direct. "We won't be contributing financially. We've got the Mallory's Charity Gala Committee to chair this year, and we're redoing the master bath." What they didn't know was that I hadn't expected their help. Grandfather Harold had secretly established a modest fund that would cover some expenses, and I'd lined up part-time jobs for the rest. Their refusal was expected. Almost a relief it meant I owed them nothing. My high school graduation ceremony was a study in contrasts. My parents attended because not doing so would raise questions among their social circle, but they spent most of the ceremony networking with other parents. Harold, however, sat front and center, beaming with unrestrained pride as I collected my diploma and the school's citizenship award. The last conversation I had with Harold, before leaving for college, remains etched in my memory. We sat on his porch swing, watching fireflies blink in the summer dusk. "You're going to go much further than you can see right now, Derek," he said quietly. "Sometimes the people who should lift you up are too weak to do it. Find strength in that knowledge, not bitterness." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. It would take years for the wisdom of his words to fully reveal itself. "There's more to my story than people know," he added cryptically. "Someday you'll understand why I've lived the way I have. Just remember that true wealth isn't what's in your bank account." Those words would echo back to me in ways I couldn't possibly have imagined. Massachusetts State University wasn't an Ivy League school, but it offered me something far more valuable than prestige freedom. For the first time, I could define myself on my own terms, without the constant shadow of my parents' disappointment. My dorm room was tiny, shared with a music major named Jake, who practiced clarinet at odd hours, but it felt more like home than any place I'd lived before. I'd brought few possessions, some clothes, books, and a framed photo of Grandfather Harold and me fishing at Cape Cod when I was 12. During orientation week, I checked my phone daily, half expecting some message from my parents, perhaps belated advice, or simply acknowledgement of this milestone. Nothing came. I'd sent them my contact information and dorm address via email, receiving only an automated vacation response from my mother's real estate account. Grandfather Harold, however, called every Sunday evening like clockwork. "How's my future Supreme Court Justice doing?" he'd joke, before listening intently as I shared details about classes, professors, and campus life. During my first semester break, when going to my parents' house wasn't an option I wanted to exercise, Harold invited me to stay with him. He'd had a minor heart scare but dismissed it as plumbing issues and didn't want me to worry. "The doctors say I need to take it easier," he admitted, as we shared a modest Thanksgiving dinner at his kitchen table. "Seems these old pipes are getting a bit rusty." I noticed he moved more slowly, his hands occasionally trembling when he thought I wasn't looking. Still, his mind remained sharp as ever, asking insightful questions about my pre-law studies and offering perspectives that often exceeded what my professors provided. To cover my expenses, I worked 3 part-time jobs: morning shifts at the campus coffee shop, evening hours in the law library, and weekend work doing data entry for a local attorney. The schedule was grueling but necessary, and perhaps it was also a blessing staying busy kept me from dwelling on my family situation. By sophomore year, I discovered a natural aptitude for legal studies. My constitutional law professor, James Wright, took notice after I'd thoroughly dismantled another student's argument during a class debate. "Wilson," he called out as students filed out after class. "Got a minute?" Professor Wright was a former prosecutor with a reputation for being brilliant but unapproachable. In his 50s with salt and pepper hair and perpetually furrowed brows, he was simultaneously feared and revered by students. "That was an impressive argument you made today," he said, leaning against his desk. "You cited precedents most second-year law students wouldn't know." I explained about my long-standing interest in law and my grandfather's encouragement. He nodded, studying me with new interest. "The Anderson firm is looking for a part-time clerk. Mostly filing and coffee runs, but you'd be in the environment." I could put in a word. That recommendation changed everything. Anderson & Michaels wasn't the biggest firm in the city, but it specialized in family and estate law, ironically, the very issues that would later become central to my life. The modest salary allowed me to drop one of my other jobs, and the experience proved invaluable. Meanwhile, my parents' absence from my life continued. Through distant family connections and occasional social media glimpses, I learned they had renovated their home, joined an exclusive country club, and taken luxury vacations to Europe and the Bahamas. The financial struggles they'd claimed when refusing to help with my education seemed suspiciously absent from their lifestyle. During my junior year, scrolling through my mother's public Instagram posts, a form of digital self-flagellation I occasionally indulged in, I saw photos of them at a charity gala. Supporting the next generation, read the caption beneath an image of them, handing an oversized check to a private school foundation. The irony cut deep. It was around this time that I made a conscious decision to completely separate myself from their name and influence. I wouldn't seek their approval, references, or connections. Whatever I achieved would be entirely my own. Grandfather Harold's health continued its slow decline, though he tried to hide it during our calls and my visits. I made the 90-minute trip to see him as often as my schedule allowed, sometimes arriving to find him napping in his recliner, medical bottles lined up on the side table. "Just getting old, Derek," he'd insist when I expressed concern. Nothing to worry about. But I did worry, especially knowing he was navigating his health challenges alone. My father never visited him, a fact Harold never complained about but which I found increasingly infuriating. The spring of my senior year brought a major triumph: acceptance to Capital Law School with a substantial scholarship. The school ranked in the top 20 nationally, and the scholarship was based entirely on merit. Professor Wright had written a glowing recommendation, noting my exceptional analytical abilities and uncommon empathy qualities that made me not just a promising legal mind, but potentially a transformative force in the field. When I called Harold with the news, the pride in his voice was palpable. "I always knew it, Derek," he said, his voice slightly weaker than I remembered but filled with joy. "From the time you were arguing for extra dessert with better reasoning than most lawyers I've known." He insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate when I next visited, though I could tell the outing taxed his strength. As we sat in his favorite local steakhouse, Harold raised his glass of water. alcohol no longer mixing well with his medications. "To the future, Judge Wilson," he said with a wink. "May you always see the person behind the case." I'd never felt more seen or more supported than I did in that moment, even as I worried about the visible decline in the one person who had truly been family to me. Law school hit like a tidal wave, relentless, overwhelming, and transformative. The workload made my undergraduate years seem like vacation by comparison, but I thrived on the challenge. Capital Law School's campus buzzed with ambition and intellectual energy that matched my own growing determination. My focus narrowed to family law and estate planning areas that addressed questions of obligation, fairness, and intent. Perhaps it was inevitable given my background, though I didn't consciously make the connection at first. I just found myself drawn to cases where the letter of the law intersected with complex human relationships. Professor Eleanor Simmons, our Estates and Trusts instructor, noted my aptitude during office hours. "Wilson, your analysis of the Bernstein case was exceptional," she said, referencing a complicated will contest I'd dissected for a class assignment. "You have an unusual ability to see both the technical legal issues and the human elements at play." I thanked her, but didn't share how personal the subject felt. How I'd learned through Harold about the importance of legacy and intention. By the end of my first year, I'd secured a position in the top 5% of my class and been invited to join law review achievements that opened doors to summer associate positions at respectable firms. I accepted an offer from Littlefield and Barnes, a mid-sized practice with a strong reputation in family and estate law. Throughout this period, I maintained my privacy about my family situation. Classmates spoke of parents who were doctors, executives, or fellow attorneys. When asked, I kept my responses vague, mentioning only that I was largely self-supporting. I had no interest in being seen as either disadvantaged or bitter. The story I was writing would be defined by achievement, not abandonment. The summer after my first year of law school brought the news I'd been dreading. Harold called on a Tuesday evening instead of our usual Sunday, immediately sending up warning flags. "Derek." His voice sounded thinner over the phone. "The doctors found something. Cancer. Pancreatic. It's not the good kind, if there is such a thing." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Harold had been my constant, my true north, when everything else shifted. The thought of losing him left me breathless with a panic I hadn't felt since childhood. "I'm coming this weekend," I said, already mentally rearranging my schedule and commitments. "No need to disrupt your studies," he protested weakly. "I'll be there Friday night," I insisted, brooking no argument. From that point forward, my weekends belonged to Harold. I'd finish classes on Friday, drive the 3 hours to his home, and return late Sunday for Monday classes. The grueling schedule took its toll on my sleep and study time, but I compensated by becoming ruthlessly efficient with every minute. What little social life I'd developed was sacrificed without hesitation. Harold's modest home gradually transformed into a medical space, a hospital bed in the living room, oxygen tanks, medication schedules posted on the refrigerator. I learned to change IV bags, administer medications, and interpret the various beeps and readings of monitoring equipment. During these weekend vigils, our conversations deepened. Free from the constraints of time and distracted by pain, Harold began sharing more about his life. "Your grandmother was the love of my life," he told me one evening as I adjusted his pillows. "After she died, I realized something important. All the money in the world can't replace 1 minute with someone you truly love." He shared how he'd built his construction supply business from nothing, working 18-hour days, while still making time for family dinners. "Your father never understood the value of work," Harold said, his voice tinged not with bitterness but sadness. "He saw the results but missed the purpose. Thought wealth was the point rather than what you do with it." Most surprisingly, he began alluding to financial decisions I'd never known about. "I made some good investments over the years," he mentioned casually during one of his more lucid moments between pain medications. "Didn't see the point in showing it off. Just quietly put it to work." When I pressed for details, he'd smile mysteriously and change the subject. "All in good time, counselor. All in good time." On particularly good days, I'd bring my law books and study while sitting beside him. He loved hearing about the cases I was analyzing, offering surprisingly sharp insights despite having no formal legal education. "The law is just formalized fairness," he'd observe, "or at least it should be." During one such session, I mentioned an upcoming law school competition, a mock trial where students would argue a complex estate case before visiting judges from the appellate court. "You'll win it," Harold said, with such certainty that I almost believed him despite the fierce competition I faced. The case involved a contested will where questions of undue influence and testamentary capacity were central issues that would later become painfully relevant to my own situation. I prepared obsessively, using every spare moment between classes, work, and caring for Harold. The competition spanned 3 days of preliminary rounds before culminating in a final argument. Somewhat to my surprise, I advanced to the final round, facing off against Stephanie Patel, a third-year student with an intimidating reputation. The judges fired questions testing our knowledge of precedent and statute. When Patel faltered on a particularly obscure point, I not only provided the correct citation but explained the underlying reasoning in a way that connected emotionally with the case at hand. When the chief judge announced my victory, I felt a surge of pride knowing how pleased Harold would be. I called him immediately from the courthouse steps, still holding the trophy. "I won, Grandpa," I said, reverting to the childhood term of endearment I rarely used anymore. The line was silent for a moment before a nurse answered. "He's having a difficult day, Mr. Wilson," she explained gently, "but I'll tell him. I'm sure it will lift his spirits when he's more alert." That weekend, I brought the trophy to his bedside. Harold was having one of his better days, sitting up slightly and immediately noticing the trophy in my hands. "Told you," he said with a weak smile. "Never bet against a Wilson with something to prove." We sat in companionable silence for a while before he spoke again, his voice suddenly serious. "Derek, I need you to know something. I've made provisions for after. Don't let anyone make you feel you don't deserve every bit of it." I tried to change the subject, unwilling to discuss a future without him, but he persisted. "Your parents will show up, you know, like vultures when they smell money. Remember who was there for you when it mattered." Before I could respond, he drifted off to sleep, the conversation left hanging like an unfinished legal argument. 2 weeks later, I received the call during evidence class. Harold had slipped away peacefully in his sleep. I walked out mid-lecture, drove to his home in a fog of grief, and sat alone in his favorite chair until morning. The funeral was small. Harold hadn't maintained many close relationships in his later years. To my shock and slow-building anger, my parents did attend, dressed immaculately, and expressing perfectly calibrated public grief while avoiding direct interaction with me. Such a loss, I overheard my mother telling an elderly cousin. "We were so close." The lie made my hands shake with rage, but I maintained my composure. Harold deserved a dignified farewell, not a family confrontation. It wasn't until after the service, when the attorney Harold had retained approached everyone about the reading of the will, that my parents acknowledged me directly. "Derek," my father said, his hand suddenly on my shoulder in a gesture of familiarity that felt like trespass. "It's been too long. We should catch up." His eyes, so similar to Harold's in color but lacking all their warmth, darted to the attorney and back to me calculating, assessing potential advantage. I simply nodded, not trusting myself to speak without unleashing years of accumulated resentment. The reading was scheduled for the following week, and I returned to law school in the interim, throwing myself into studies as both distraction and armor against the grief threatening to overwhelm me. The reading of Harold Wilson's will took place in the wood-paneled conference room of Simmons & Watts, a small but respected local firm. I arrived early, dressed in a conservative dark suit, and chose a seat at the far end of the table from where my parents would likely sit. Minutes later, they arrived together. My mother in an expensive black dress that seemed more appropriate for a cocktail party than a will reading, my father checking his watch repeatedly, as if he had more important appointments waiting. Martin Simmons, a contemporary of Harold's with thick glasses and a deliberate manner of speech, served as executor. 3 other distant relatives I barely recognized also attended, presumably named as minor beneficiaries. "Before we begin," Simmons stated, adjusting his glasses, "I want to note that Harold was of completely sound mind when this will was prepared and updated 6 months ago. He underwent cognitive assessment specifically to forestall any challenges." My father shifted in his seat but remained silent as Simmons began reading the formal legal preamble. The minor bequest came first $10,000 to Harold's church, $5,000 each to 2 longtime friends, a fishing rod collection to his neighbor. Then came the bombshell that would change everything. "The remainder of my estate," Simmons read, his voice steady, including all real property, financial accounts, investment portfolios, and personal effects. "I leave to my grandson, Derek James Wilson, who has shown the character, judgment, and humanity that represents the best of our family legacy." A sharp intake of breath from my mother broke the silence. My father's face flushed deep red. "Furthermore," Simmons continued, "I specifically direct that no portion of my estate shall pass to my son, Thomas Wilson, or his wife, Marilyn Wilson, who have demonstrated through their actions a disregard for the values of family responsibility and integrity that I hold dear." The room froze in stunned silence before my father found his voice. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, half rising from his chair. "How much are we talking about here? Dad lived modestly. There can't be that much at stake." Simmons removed his glasses, polished them slowly, then looked directly at my father. "The total value of Harold Wilson's estate, as of last month's accounting, stands at approximately $24 million. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the conference table to steady myself, certain I had misheard. "That's impossible!" my father nearly shouted. "He ran a small construction supply company. He lived in a 3-bedroom ranch house his entire life." "Your father," Simmons replied calmly, "was an exceptionally shrewd investor who chose to live simply while his wealth grew. He was also an early angel investor in several technology companies that proved quite successful." My mother, recovering from her shock faster than anyone, immediately turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Derek, darling, this is overwhelming for everyone. We should discuss this as a family." Before I could respond, Simmons slid an envelope across the table to me. "Harold asked that you read this privately," he said, "though I'm familiar with its contents." I took the envelope, my name written in Harold's distinctive handwriting, and tucked it into my jacket pocket. The message could wait. I needed to process the unreality of the moment. "I'll need time to consider next steps," I said, standing to signal my desire to end the meeting. "You've manipulated an old man," my father said, his voice low and dangerous as I passed his chair. "This won't stand." 1 week later, I received formal notice that my parents had filed suit contesting the will, claiming undue influence and diminished capacity, exactly the issues I'd argued in my law school competition. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so painful. Their attorney, Andrew Jackson of Taylor, Jackson & Pierce, had a reputation for aggressive tactics in high-stakes estate disputes. The initial filing included inflammatory allegations that I had systematically isolated the deceased from his family and exploited his vulnerability for financial gain. Reading these accusations in black and white legal language made me physically ill. That evening, alone in my apartment, I finally opened Harold's letter. "Dear Derek." It began in handwriting more unsteady than the envelope's address. "If you're reading this, 2 things have happened. I've left this world, and you've learned about your inheritance. I imagine both have come as a shock. The money was never important to me except as a means to do good. After your grandmother died, I realized how temporary our time here is, and how permanent our impact can be if we choose wisely. I've watched you grow into a man of integrity despite having parents who showed you none. I've seen you work harder than anyone should have to for opportunities that should have been freely given to you out of love. Your father once told me he didn't want you to have handouts because it would make you weak. The truth is that supporting someone isn't a handout, it's what family does. He and your mother failed that most basic test. I have documented their neglect over the years, missed birthdays, refused college support despite financial ability, and complete absence during your achievements. Not for bitterness, but for this moment, knowing they would challenge my decision. This money is yours because you've already proven you'll use it wisely. Don't let anyone make you doubt that you deserve it, not your parents, not the court, and not yourself. Remember what I've always told you. True wealth is measured by what you give, not what you have. All my love, Grandpa Harold. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, tears blurring my vision. In that moment of grief and gratitude, I made 2 decisions. I would fight my parents' lawsuit with everything I had, and I would honor Harold's legacy in ways beyond simply inheriting his money. The next day, I began receiving calls and messages from extended family members I barely knew, some sympathetic but most clearly angling for a share if I made things right with my parents. One cousin plainly suggested that family peace might be worth a small percentage. Investigation revealed that my parents had accumulated significant debt maintaining their lifestyle of luxury cars, country club memberships, and status-signaling vacations. The sudden prospect of millions slipping through their fingers had made them desperate, and desperation makes for dangerous opponents. As preliminary legal maneuvers began, I faced a critical decision: hire expensive counsel to defend against my parents' claims or represent myself. While conventional wisdom advised against self-representation, I had unique advantages: intimate knowledge of the facts, specialized education in exactly this area of law, and perhaps most importantly, the absolute moral certainty that I was honoring Harold's wishes. After consulting with Professor Simmons, who offered to serve as consulting counsel, I filed my appearance as pro se defendant. The stage was set for a family showdown none of us had anticipated, but which, in retrospect, had been brewing for decades. The weeks leading up to the trial transformed my apartment into a war room. Case files, legal precedents, and strategic outlines covered every surface. My final semester of law school continued in parallel, creating a punishing schedule that left little time for sleep, much less personal life. Professor Wright, who had become both mentor and friend over the years, offered his office for practice sessions, where I could refine arguments against expected challenges. "Your parents' case hinges on painting you as manipulative and Harold as mentally compromised," he noted during one such session. "They'll try to provoke emotional reactions to undermine your credibility." I nodded, making notes. "I've pulled every precedent in the state relating to testamentary capacity. Harold's medical records clearly show he was cognitively intact, despite physical decline." Wright leaned back in his chair, studying me. "This isn't just about the law, Derek. It's personal in a way few cases ever are. How are you managing that aspect?" It was a fair question. The legal arguments were straightforward. The emotional landscape was anything but. "I keep coming back to what Harold would want," I answered after a moment. "He valued clarity and purpose. Getting emotional would dishonor that." 2 weeks before trial, my parents' attorney made a settlement offer 1/3 of the estate to be transferred to them in exchange for dropping the case. The offer came with thinly veiled threats about embarrassing family revelations that might emerge in open court. I declined without hesitation. This wasn't about money anymore, but about truth and consequences. Concepts I'd committed my professional life to upholding. As the case gained attention due to the amount involved, local legal publications began covering the dispute. One particularly thorough article mentioned my position on law review and recent clerkship at Davidson and Fleming, a prestigious firm known for complex litigation. What the article didn't mention, because few people knew, was that I had recently accepted a junior partnership track position at that same firm upon graduation. My work during a summer associateship had impressed the senior partners enough to make a rare pre-graduation offer. This information would become relevant sooner than I anticipated. 3 days before trial, I met with Martin Simmons to review Harold's documentation. True to his word, my grandfather had methodically preserved evidence of my parents' absence throughout my life. Returned birthday cards, unanswered invitations to school events, and most damning, emails between them discussing vacation plans during my college graduation with explicit acknowledgement that they were choosing social opportunities over family obligation. "Harold was thorough," Simmons commented, indicating a thick folder. "He also kept records of every contribution he made toward your education and well-being, with notes about your parents' refusals to assist, despite documented financial ability." The evening before trial, I stood before the mirror in my apartment, rehearsing opening statements and adjusting the tie on the best suit I owned, purchased with my first law firm paycheck. The face looking back at me showed little resemblance to the uncertain boy who had once craved his parents' approval. Years of self-reliance had forged something stronger, something Harold had seen taking shape long before I recognized it myself. I removed his letter from my desk drawer and read it one last time before tucking it into my inner suit pocket, close to my heart. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, I would carry his confidence with me. Morning arrived with crystalline clarity. I packed my briefcase, methodically case files, Harold's documentation, relevant statutes tabbed for quick reference. The weight of preparation settled my nerves as I drove to the courthouse. In the marble hallway outside courtroom 305, I spotted my parents huddled with their attorney. My mother wore a conservative navy dress that seemed calculated to project maternal dignity, while my father's gray suit and subdued tie suggested sober responsibility. Their carefully constructed image contrasted sharply with the reality I had lived. As I approached, my mother's eyes flicked over me dismissively before returning to their conversation. The gesture was so familiar, so consistent with a lifetime of similar dismissals, that it almost made me smile. Some things never changed, but I had. The bailiff called our case, and we filed into the wood-paneled courtroom where Judge Robert Harmon presided. At 60, with silver hair and reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, Harmon was known for cutting through emotional arguments to focus on legal merit. I took my position at the defense table alone, arranging my materials with practiced calm, aware of the whispers from spectators who had gathered for what promised to be an interesting family drama. As Judge Harmon entered and took his seat, I stood with proper deference, mentally preparing for the opening statements to come. What I hadn't prepared for was the flash of recognition that crossed his face as his gaze settled on me. All rise. The Superior Court for Suffolk County is now in session, the Honorable Judge Robert Harmon presiding. The formal announcement brought everyone to their feet as Judge Harmon entered, his robes flowing behind him. He took his seat at the bench, surveyed the courtroom briefly, then did a visible double-take when his eyes landed on me. "Counselors, please state your appearances for the record," he instructed, regaining his composure. Andrew Jackson for the plaintiffs, Thomas and Marilyn Wilson, my parents' attorney announced with practiced authority. Derek Wilson, appearing pro se as defendant, I stated clearly. Judge Harmon leaned forward, peering over his reading glasses. "Mr. Wilson, Derek Wilson, you argued before my court in the Sullivan property dispute last year, did you not? With Davidson and Fleming?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. From the corner of my eye, I could see my parents exchanging confused glances. "Yes, Your Honor," I confirmed. "I second-chaired that case during my clerkship." "Excellent work on that brief," Harmon nodded, "particularly the analysis of implied easements." "Thank you, Your Honor." Jackson cleared his throat loudly. "Your Honor, if we might proceed with the matter at hand." "Yes, of course," Harmon agreed, settling back. "This is an action contesting the will of Harold Wilson. Plaintiffs allege undue influence and diminished testamentary capacity. Mr. Jackson, your opening statement." Jackson launched into a carefully crafted narrative painting Harold as a vulnerable elderly man manipulated by a calculating grandson who had driven a wedge between Harold and his son. "The evidence will show," Jackson concluded with practiced gravity, "that Harold Wilson was isolated from his family during his final years, subjected to continuous influence from the defendant during a time of cognitive vulnerability, resulting in a will that defies natural family relationships and reasonable expectations." As Jackson returned to his seat, my mother dabbed at completely dry eyes with a tissue, a performance for the judge's benefit. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Harmon nodded toward me. "Your opening statement." I rose slowly, buttoning my suit jacket, and approached the podium. The courtroom felt simultaneously vast and intimate as all eyes focused on me. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about family relationships and reasonable expectations, but not in the way Mr. Jackson suggests." I deliberately made eye contact with my parents before continuing. "The evidence will show that Harold Wilson was of sound mind when he drafted his will, that his decisions were based on a clear pattern of family dynamics established over decades, and that far from being isolated from family, he was the only family member who consistently showed up when it mattered." For the next several minutes, I outlined the facts simply and clearly: my parents' long-standing pattern of neglect, Harold's consistent support, and most importantly, the extensive documentation Harold had maintained precisely to prevent this challenge. This court will see medical evaluations confirming Harold Wilson's cognitive clarity until his final days. You'll see evidence of deliberate estate planning spanning years, not a hasty decision made under pressure. But most significantly, you'll see documented proof that the plaintiffs voluntarily removed themselves from my life and from Harold's life, making their current claims of family connection purely financial in motivation. I concluded by referencing relevant precedents supporting testamentary freedom, the legal principle that individuals have the right to dispose of their property as they choose, even when those choices disappoint certain family members. As the trial proceeded, Each piece of evidence seemed to build upon the last. Harold's doctors testified to his mental acuity despite physical decline. His financial advisors detailed his methodical investment strategy and deliberate decision to live below his means while growing his wealth. The most damaging testimony came from Harold's longtime neighbor, who recounted conversations where my parents had complained about Harold's unhealthy attachment to me while declining multiple invitations to join holiday gatherings. They always had somewhere more important to be, the neighbor testified. Some fancy event or trip. Meanwhile, Derek was there shoveling Harold's walk in winter and mowing his lawn in summer, even while attending law school. When my parents took the stand, their testimony seemed rehearsed and hollow. My father claimed deep emotional connection with Harold, despite phone records showing just 3 calls in the 2 years before Harold's death, all lasting less than 5 minutes. My mother's testimony proved particularly damaging to their case when she couldn't recall basic details about Harold's life, including his late wife's name or the date of his retirement. During cross-examination, I maintained professional demeanor while methodically exposing contradictions. "Mrs. Wilson," I asked my mother, "you testified that you were extremely close with Harold Wilson, correct?" "Yes, very close," she insisted, smoothing her skirt. "He was like a father to me." "Could you please look at Defendant's Exhibit 14, I requested, handing her a printed email. "This is correspondence between you and the Hamptons Shore Club dated May 15th, 3 years ago. Could you read the highlighted portion?" Her face paled slightly as she scanned the document. "We regretfully must decline the grandfather-grandson event," she read stiffly, "as we have prior commitments. And the next highlighted section, please. To be honest, Thomas hardly speaks to his father anyway, and Derek spends far too much time with the old man as it is." "No further questions," I said quietly. As the trial entered its second day, Judge Harmon's patience with my parents' case visibly thinned. When Jackson attempted to introduce speculation about conversations no one had witnessed, Harmon shut him down firmly. "Counselor, this court deals in evidence, not conjecture. Do you have actual testimony about these alleged statements?" During closing arguments, Jackson emphasized natural family bonds and parental expectations, attempting to frame Harold's decision as an unnatural deviation requiring explanation. My closing focused on Harold's clear intent and legal right to distribute his assets according to his values and relationships. "Your Honor," I concluded, "Harold Wilson's will represents the culmination of a lifetime of carefully observed family dynamics. He didn't disinherit my parents on a whim or due to manipulation. He made a reasoned decision based on decades of their choices and actions. The law recognizes testamentary freedom precisely because the testator often has insights into family relationships that courts cannot fully appreciate from the outside. Harold Wilson knew exactly what he was doing and why. His wishes deserve to be honored." Judge Harmon recessed to consider his ruling, returning just 2 hours later, unusually quick for a case of this complexity. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony presented, he began, his tone measured, "This court finds no credible evidence of either undue influence or diminished capacity in the execution of Harold Wilson's will." My shoulders relaxed slightly as he continued. "The plaintiffs have failed to meet their burden of proof on all counts. The clear weight of evidence supports that Harold Wilson was of sound mind, acting of his own volition, and with full understanding of his estate planning decisions." Harmon removed his glasses, looking directly at my parents. "This court is troubled by the plaintiff's apparent attempt to rewrite a family history clearly documented in the record. Family relationships involve reciprocal obligations that can't be ignored for decades, and then conveniently remembered when money appears." He replaced his glasses, returning to formal language. "The will of Harold Wilson is hereby upheld in its entirety. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice, court costs to be paid by the plaintiffs." With a sharp rap of his gavel, it was over. I had honored Harold's wishes and protected his legacy from those who had valued neither during his lifetime. As people began filing out of the courtroom, my parents approached with Jackson trailing behind. "This isn't over," my father began, his voice low and threatening. I held up a hand to stop him. "Actually, it is. The judge dismissed with prejudice, meaning you cannot refile. Any appeal would face the same evidence and likely result in the same outcome." My mother stepped forward, switching tactics with alarming speed. "Derek, darling, we're still family. Surely we can come to some arrangement now that the legal unpleasantness is behind us." For a moment, I was 8 years old again, waiting for parents who never showed up for my school play. I was 16, achieving academic honors that went unacknowledged. I was 18, facing college without family support. Then I remembered Harold's words, "True wealth is measured by what you give, not what you have." "I'll have my firm draft an agreement," I said, surprising them both. "I'm setting up a trust fund of $100,000 each for you, accessible in annual installments. Not because you deserve it, but because Harold taught me that generosity matters, especially when it's difficult." The shock on their faces was almost worth the decades of neglect. "Your firm?" my father stammered. "Davidson and Fleming," I clarified. "I'm joining as junior partner after graduation next month. Judge Harmon remembers me from a case I worked on during my clerkship there." Understanding finally dawned in their eyes, not just about the inheritance, but about who I had become without their help or knowledge. In the weeks that followed, I established the Harold Wilson Foundation for Educational Opportunity, dedicating the majority of the inheritance to supporting students who, like me, faced educational journeys without family backing. The foundation's first year funded 30 full scholarships for promising students who demonstrated both need and potential. I kept Harold's modest house, renovating it slightly but maintaining its character. Some weekends, I still sit in his old chair, imagining our conversations continuing across the divide of time and space. 6 months after the trial, I visited his grave on what would have been his 75th birthday. The autumn leaves crunched beneath my feet as I placed a small stone on top of his headstone, a tradition he had taught me, representing permanence of memory. "The first scholarship recipients are doing well, Grandpa," I said to the quiet air. "One studying engineering, another pre-med. They all wrote thank you letters. I think you'd like them." The wind rustled through nearly bare branches as I continued updating him on the foundation's work and my early cases at the firm. In those peaceful moments, I felt his presence not as grief, but as continuing guidance. The journey from neglected child to successful attorney had been neither straight nor easy. The courtroom confrontation with my parents represented not just the culmination of a legal battle, but the closing of an emotional chapter. In standing up for Harold's wishes, I had also finally stood up for myself. What would you have done in my position? Would you have shared any of the inheritance with family who only showed interest when money appeared? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against your own parents? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Your support helps me continue sharing these life lessons. Thank you for listening to my journey from abandoned son to courtroom victor, and remember that true family is defined by love and presence, not by blood alone.